So how am I going to know, as the helper, what state of change my veteran's in?
You pay attention to what we call change talk and what we call sustained talk, two different types of speech, of language that we listen for. Let me define those a little bit. Change talk is a client's expression of the argument to change. They're talking about change. Where sustained talk is a client's expression of the argument not to change. They're verbalizing why they want to stay the same. An example of change talk might be, it would be good for me to get out and socialize more. I'm talking about change in a positive way. Where an example of sustained talk with the same topic might be, it's easier for me just to stay home and watch TV than it is to go out and try to meet people.
Right.
And change talk predicts change.
So change talk predicts actual change.
Exactly right. That's why it's so important, and what motivational interviewing does around that is pays a lot of attention to change talk and helps move the client toward more change talk.
More change talk is more better.
Is more better.
Okay.
There are several studies that actually compare MI to more directive and more even authoritative or confrontational styles, and here's what they find regarding change talk. MI clients verbalize twice as much change talk and 50% less sustained talk. So MI increases change talk, and we know that change talk predicts a change in the behavior. The extent to which clients verbally defend the status quo, that's sustained talk, that's inversely related to behavior change. Where the extent to which clients verbally argue for change, they're saying change talk,
right,
that's directly related to behavior change. We tend to act on the side for which we argue is the lesson learned.
So what are the different kinds of change talk we might hear in a conversation about change?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are so many different kinds, and it's relatively important that we can pick those out. Mostly important that we just are aware of change talk, but it helps if we know the different kinds. And we have a mnemonic for that.
Of course.
Of course, and it's called darn cats. Let me take the first part, the darn. This is preparatory change talk. They're preparing to make change. The D in darn stands for desire. These statements indicate a client's desire to change. You might hear a client say, I'd like to quit drinking if I could, or I want to be able to take better care of my kids. I want. It expresses a desire toward change. The A in darn stands for ability. These statements indicate a client's belief that they have the ability to change. It's a statement of self-efficacy, belief in themselves. You may hear clients say, for example, I could stop drinking if I put my mind to it. Or even, that might be possible. It speaks to their ability to change. And again, this is change talk. We want more of this. The third is reason. Statements that demonstrate the reasons clients have for making the change. Examples you might hear, I think quitting will improve my self-esteem, or my partner will dump me if I keep doing this. It's reasons they make to make the change. The N for darn stands for need. This kind of change talk speaks to the client's expressed need for change. I need to stop drinking. I got to do this change or I'll die. That's the darn, preparatory. It's kind of marching up a hill. It's a lot of work, preparing to make change. The second part of darn cats, is what we call mobilizing change talk. The C stands for commitment. Statements that signal the likelihood of change. For example, you might hear, I'm going to call my buddy and see where he went for treatment. Or, I'm through living like this and I'm going to get some help. It's about commitment to change. The A in cats is activation. These statements indicate a movement toward action, but not quite a commitment. You might hear someone say, I'm willing to go talk to someone, or I'm ready to give it a go. Not quite a commitment, but it's moved in that direction.
Right.
The T and the S is for taking steps. These are statements indicating the person has already done something in the direction of change. For example, I don't drive by that bar anymore. Or I looked up a list of self-help groups in the area. They've already made some steps, and I noticed that we often miss these. They come in already having made some movement toward change.
Well, they're in your office too.
And they're in the office. They've already made some kind of commitment. Now, some are forced to be there, as you know, but some come voluntarily. So, now, it's not just having these attributes like desire and ability, but it's also the frequency of these statements, how often they use change talk, and perhaps more importantly, is the strength of these statements. So, and as an example, under the category of desire to change, listen to the difference in the strength or intensity of these two examples. One, I may want to talk to a counselor one of these days. The second one, I really want to talk to a counselor as soon as possible.
Yeah, that second one sounds a bit more intense or real.
It does. The first one's kind of lukewarm, a little wishy-washy. Now, it's still moving toward change, so we want to honor that. Both are okay.
Okay.
But one has much more intensity behind it. Studies show a person must typically have both desire and belief in their ability to make changes. And a quick plug for affirmations.
Yeah.
The use of affirmations certainly helps with a person's belief in their self-efficacy or their ability to make changes.
Now, we've talked a lot, or you've talked a lot about the ideas of talking and moving and those kinds of things. When are we going to get to action?
You're ready for action.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. So let's go there. Let's talk about action. So how do we know when to make that move into action? We know already we don't want to be too far ahead of the client. If they're at pre-contemplation, not even thinking it's a problem, we can't rush in with solutions. So how do we know? We know when the client's change talk becomes stronger, more frequent, and moves into the language of commitment. So they want to up that hill of darn, talking about desire and abilities, and the strength and frequency are beginning to increase. And they peak the top. Now they're starting to talk about the cat's part, about commitment. They're mobilizing their efforts to change. That's when we can move into planning. Now there's a couple of tools that we use to more specifically gauge this, besides just listening for change talk. We use what we call scaling rulers. You can use this around a lot of different elements that a person is experiencing when they're thinking about change, like how important is change to them, or how ready are they, how committed. So let me talk a little bit about the scaling rulers. If we're trying to gauge how important this element is, this change is for the client, we might say, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very high and 1 being very low, how important is making this change to you? If we're trying to gauge where they are with their ability, we may say, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very high and 1 being very low, how capable do you feel in your ability to make this change? It may be important to them, but if they don't feel capable, we're not going to move very far along in the planning process. A few other examples using these scales. A readiness scale, again, 1 to 10, how ready are you to make a change? Or a commitment scale, 1 to 10, how committed are you to making this change? And while you probably won't ask all of these scaling questions, each will give you indication about when to start making a plan. And how you respond to their responses on these scaling questions matters. For example, if they offer a score of 6, avoid saying, why not a 7 or 8? Why didn't you scale it higher?
That's maybe what I'm thinking. So if they say 6, I'm thinking, come on, man, you need to be a 9.
Yeah, why not a little further up?
Right.
And it's okay to think it. But if you ask that question,
That way.
why not higher, you're actually asking them to defend why they can't make that change.
Oh, okay.
What do you mean you're not able? You only gave it a 6. Why isn't it a 9? Well, because I'm not very capable. I don't have this. I don't have that. They begin arguing for sustaining their current behaviors.
Yeah.
And we know that we want more change talk and less sustained talk.
So what do you do instead?
Instead, if a person says on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm at a 6, we say a 6. Why not lower? Why not a 2 or even a 5? They then are being invited to argue of why they are committed or able or motivated for change.
So you're promoting change talk when you do it that way.
We're eliciting the change talk, which we know is a predictor for actually making change.
Wow.
Now, keep in mind, the plan of change might simply be to help the client get referred to another agency. It's not always about some other kind of life change. But that is a change itself. So you're working with them on getting to the right people. And I think VSOs are in a particularly opportune position to help hear about the problems, create a good environment, elicit some conversation, and maybe get them over that bump to go and get the help that they need and deserve.
This is all well and good, and we're going to approach our jobs with as much of our best intentions as we can, but they don't always work out. Even if you know everything there is to know about motivational interviewing or some other technique, what do you do when you have a client that's just resistant to change? MI
talks about traps to avoid,
okay,
to keep the resistance or the discord lower. One is the question-answer trap, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier. We want to avoid setting up a situation where we ask a question and they respond. Question, answer, question, answer. Instead, question, answer, reflect, that expands it, reflect, that expands it. So use reflections and use open-ended questions. Avoid the Q&A trap. Another trap they refer to as the labeling trap. We just try to avoid using labels, whether it's around physical health or mental health issues. Usually it's not helpful in this context. Other traps, one we call the premature focus trap. This is focusing too quickly on a problem. They want to talk about lots of things in their lives, and they really haven't given permission yet to dial in on one particular problem, let alone have a discussion about that problem. So don't move too fast in focusing on the problem. There's also the now or never trap. This happens when we try to convince the client that right now is the best and perhaps only time to make this change. That's not always the case. There's also the taking sides trap. This is that righting reflex we spoke about earlier. If we argue too much and take the side of the argument for change, they're likely to take the side of the argument or sustain talk and argue against change. Taking sides trap. There's the blaming trap. This happens when we blame the client for the discord or the resistance in the conversation that we're having. And instead, we want to look at how we both fit into this. Not that they're being resistant, they're just expressing ambivalence. But if it's not going well, what do we need to do differently?
Right.
And what can I do differently? That's the blaming trap. The scared straight trap, the belief that scaring the person will make them change. And this typically doesn't work. If it worked, anyone who's ever had a heart attack would always eat perfectly forever again. They'd exercise well. We sometimes have those aha moments in our life, but change tends to be more slow and incremental. Not always, but tends to be. So not trying to scare them into doing what we think is the right thing. Also, the shame game trap. This operates on the assumption that we can shame someone into change, and actually it tends to make them worse. And shaming is correlated with suicide, incarcerations, and problem substance use. There's the expert trap. Now, keep in mind, we often think that because we have a lot of knowledge, all they need is the knowledge and they'll be fine. If we could just download this to them. But that's often not the case. Sometimes, but let's not assume that they don't have the knowledge. Let's not assume that's what they want or that's what they need. If it was just knowledge, nobody would be smoking. If you
Sorry, you brought up smoking. So there's a label on the cigarette package. There's all this commercial saying that smoking is bad for you.
It's hard to find someone now where all we need to do is say, Mehul, you're smoking. Did you know that's bad for your health? And you say, oh my goodness, I didn't know, and put it out. So right. We know these things. And we all have habits, that gap in who we want to be and who we are. So just pointing out the health benefits, for example, of smoking or diet is probably not going to be particularly helpful. So that's an expert trap. Two more. The wrestling trap. Instead of rolling with resistance or discord in the relationship, we tend to get into a wrestling match. So instead of sailing directly into the wind of resistance, tack back and forth to move forward. Roll with it. Last one to mention now is the giving up trap. This happens when we don't believe the person is capable of change. Clients often pick up on this belief and they fall further into a lack of self-efficacy.
We've heard a lot, or I've certainly heard a lot and learned a lot about motivational interviewing. Could you put it all together for us with some take-home points?
I will try. So I'll try to summarize some of the major pieces that I think are important to walk away with.
And isn't that one of the components of motivation?
It is. Now you've got that one too. So
Yes.
this is the summary side of things. But instead of summarizing what you've been saying, I'm going to summarize what I've been saying. So
Fair
it's
enough.
just a little different.
Okay.
So to try to give some take-home messages around this that you can think about and then later begin to practice. Remember that MI is a collaborative conversation that helps people resolve their ambivalence for change. It's simply talking about change and create an environment to do that. The overall style of MI is one of guiding, which lies somewhere between directing and following. It's a dance, not a wrestling match. You arguing for change doesn't work, and it pushes the client in the opposite direction. Create an environment where the client is free to argue for the side of change. Not you, the client argue for change. Also, ambivalence is a normal part of preparing for change. And it's better to not view resistance as someone who is just trying to avoid your help or not willing to make a change in their life. Roll with it. Roll with resistance. Also, people are more likely to be persuaded by what they hear themselves say. People change that which they give voice to. Be a detective, an ambivalence detective, as you mentioned earlier. Facilitate change by investigating the person's desires, abilities, and internal arguments for change. Through this detective work, you can help your client resolve ambivalence and live a life more congruent between who they aspire to be and their current actual behaviors. Remember, if it doesn't work, leave the door open for them to come back. The last thing I'd like to offer is that all of these things we've been talking about today, change talk and reflective listening and the ORs and the spirit of MI, there's a certain process in each conversation that you can be aware of, maybe just in the back of your mind. First, you're engaging the client. Then you're moving into focusing in on what they want to work on, what change in their life are they interested in exploring. Then you begin to evoke from them their own internal arguments, highlighting those arguments for change. Then you want to listen for when they go over that bump, they're starting to make some commitment language, the desire and ability language is stronger and more frequent, and then move into planning. So you engage, you focus, you evoke, and you plan.
Wow, this has been very powerful. I really appreciate your coming and joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Mehul.
Could I just say that, to me, you are the Mark McGuire of motivational interviewing.
I'm Mark McGuire without the physical capabilities to hit a baseball and certainly not the paycheck. Right. But it's a pleasure to be here. And please let me just say to the viewers, I so appreciate what you've done for myself, my family, this country, and what your families have sacrificed as well. Thank you for what you do and what you have done. And it's been a pleasure. I hope you find this helpful in your work.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
All right.